The Wyoming Territory, 1882. Snow devils dance across the endless prairie as Ranger Cole McKenna stares down at his two shivering daughters, ages 6 and 8, huddled beside their mother's fresh grave. Winter's coming fast, and the nearest town is 3 days' hard ride through hostile territory. His girls won't survive another week out here alone while he patrols the range. That's when he spots her. A woman in torn silk and muddy boots, stumbling through the sagebrush like she's running from hell itself. Most men would see a liability. Cole sees salvation. The woman staggers, catches herself against a weathered fence post, and Cole gets his first clear look at her face. Beneath the grime and exhaustion, she's younger than he first thought, maybe 25, with auburn hair escaping from what was once an elegant chignon. Her dress, midnight blue silk with pearl buttons, speaks of money, but the desperate way she glances over her shoulder tells a different story entirely. "Papa?" 8-year-old Margaret tugs at his coat sleeve, her voice small against the wind. "Who is that lady?" Cole's weathered hands tighten on his rifle. In his 5 years as a territorial ranger, he's learned to read danger in 100 different forms, but this woman puzzles him. She's clearly running from something, yet she moves with purpose, not panic. When she notices him watching, she doesn't cower or flee. Instead, she straightens her spine and walks directly toward him. "Sir?" she calls out, her voice carrying the refined accent of the East Coast, despite her ragged appearance. "I wonder if you might spare some water." Cole studies her carefully. Up close, he can see the intelligence in her green eyes, the determination set in her jaw. This isn't some saloon girl or desperate widow. This is a woman of breeding and education, which makes her presence in the middle of nowhere all the more troubling. "Water's scarce out here," he says finally. "Might ask what brings a lady like yourself to the middle of the territory." Something flickers across her face, fear maybe, or calculation. "I'm traveling to California. My horse threw a shoe 20 miles back." It's a lie, smooth as butter, but a lie nonetheless. Cole spent too many years tracking outlaws and deserters not to recognize deception. Still, as little Ruth whimpers behind him, pressing closer to Margaret for warmth, an impossible idea begins to form. "That's a long walk in those shoes," he observes, nodding toward her impractical leather boots, now cracked and stained with mud. The woman follows his gaze and almost smiles. "Yes, well, they weren't designed for cross-country hiking." "Cole McKenna," he says, touching the brim of his hat. "Territorial ranger. These are my daughters, Margaret and Ruth." "Evelyn," she replies after a moment's hesitation. "Evelyn Cross." Another lie, he suspects, but he files the name away. "Miss Cross, I'm going to ask you something that might sound peculiar." Her eyebrows arch with curiosity. "My wife passed 3 days ago. Fever took her fast." The words come harder than he expected. "I've got a duty to patrol this territory, but I can't leave my girls alone, and I can't take them with me. Winter's coming, and they need—" He stops, suddenly aware of how desperate he must sound. "They need a mother," Evelyn finishes softly, understanding flooding her features. Temporarily speaking, Cole clarifies quickly. "Just until I can make proper arrangements. There's a cabin, food, supplies. You'd be safe and fed, and in return, you'd want me to care for your children." She glances at Margaret and Ruth, who peer back at her with wide, curious eyes. "How do you know I'm not running from the law?" The directness of the question catches him off guard. "Are you?" "That would depend on your definition of law." Cole considers this. In the territories, the line between legal and moral often blurred beyond recognition. He's known good men branded as outlaws and criminals wearing badges. "Can you cook?" he asks finally. "Yes." "Handle a rifle?" "If necessary." "Read and write?" "Better than most." Margaret steps forward suddenly. "Are you going to be our new mama?" "Margaret," Cole warns, but Evelyn kneels down, bringing herself to the child's eye level. "I don't know," she says honestly. "Would you like me to stay for a while?" Ruth nods solemnly, and Margaret's face brightens for the first time since her mother's death. Cole extends his hand. "Then we have an agreement, Miss Cross. Shelter and protection for you, care for my daughters." Evelyn looks at his outstretched hand for a long moment, then at the two small faces watching her hopefully. Finally, she clasps his calloused palm with her own. "We have an agreement, Ranger McKenna." As they shake on it, neither notices the dust cloud rising on the horizon, still miles away but moving steadily in their direction. The morning sun cast long shadows across the trading post's weathered porch as Ezra McCain stood watching his daughters play in the dusty yard. Sarah, barely 8, clutched a corn-husked doll, while 4-year-old Mary chased a scraggly chicken between the fence posts. Their laughter should have warmed his heart, but all he could feel was the cold weight of desperation settling deeper in his chest. 3 months. That's how long it had been since consumption took his wife, leaving him to navigate the treacherous waters of single fatherhood on the frontier. 3 months of burnt meals, tangled hair, and tears he couldn't always soothe away. The ranger station was no place for little girls, but what choice did he have? The nearest town was a hard day's ride, and his duties kept him moving across dangerous territory most weeks. "Papa, Mary won't share the chicken," Sarah's voice cut through his brooding. "It's not her chicken to share," he called back, forcing lightness into his tone. "Come wash up for breakfast." As the girls reluctantly abandoned their game, a rider approached from the east, dust billowing behind a fine bay mare. Ezra's hand instinctively moved to his sidearm before he recognized the portly figure of Jeremiah Walsh, the circuit judge who made his rounds through these parts. "Morning, McCain," Walsh called, dismounting with a grunt. "Fine day for traveling." "Judge." Ezra nodded, though something in the man's demeanor set his teeth on edge. "What brings you out this way?" Walsh's eyes found the girls, now splashing water from the pump over their faces with more enthusiasm than effectiveness. "Heard about your loss. Terrible thing, losing a wife so young. These frontier hardships." He shook his head with practiced sympathy. "We're managing." "Are you?" Walsh's tone sharpened. "Because word is those little ones are living rough out here. No proper schooling, no female guidance. That's no life for children, especially girls." Ice formed in Ezra's veins. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "There's a family in Denver. Good Christian folk, well established. They've expressed interest in providing a proper home for orphaned children. My daughters aren't orphans." "Might as well be the way things stand." Walsh pulled a folded document from his coat. "I've got legal authority to place children in situations deemed unsafe or unsuitable. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, McCain." Ezra's vision blurred red around the edges. "You try to take my girls, I'll put you in the ground." "That kind of talk just proves my point." Walsh stepped back, hand hovering near his own weapon. "You've got 1 week to make proper arrangements. Find them a suitable female guardian, or I'll be back to escort them to Denver myself." The judge mounted his horse with the same theatrical authority he brought to his courtroom. 1 week, McCain. Don't test me on this." Dust swirled in his wake as he rode off, leaving Ezra standing frozen in the yard. Sarah had stopped washing her face and was staring at him with those two knowing eyes that reminded him painfully of her mother. "Who was that man, Papa?" "Nobody important, sweetheart." The lie tasted like ash. That evening, after the girls had finally settled into their bedrolls, Ezra sat on the porch cleaning his rifle and wrestling with impossible choices. He could run with them, abandon his ranger commission, and head deeper into the territories where Walsh's authority meant nothing. But that would mean a life of looking over their shoulders, and how long before someone else decided his daughters needed saving from their father? He could fight it in court, but frontier justice was swift and often arbitrary. Walsh had legal backing, and Ezra was just a widower struggling to hold his family together with calloused hands and determination. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted his dark thoughts. Another rider approached, this one moving with careful purpose through the shadows. Ezra set down his rifle and stepped into the moonlight, squinting to make out the figure. It was a woman, riding alone in the darkness. That alone was enough to raise questions out here, but as she drew closer, he could see this was no ordinary frontier wife. She sat her horse like someone accustomed to command, her bearing straight, despite obvious exhaustion. Even in the dim light, he caught the gleam of quality fabric and the deliberate way her eyes swept the area before settling on him. "Are you Ranger McCain?" Her voice carried an educated accent at odds with her presence in this remote place. "Depends on who's asking." She dismounted gracefully, though he noticed she kept one hand near what looked like a concealed weapon. "My name is Catherine Whitmore. I believe we might be able to help each other." Something in her tone made him study her more carefully. This woman was running from something, that much was clear, but there was steel beneath the refinement and intelligence in those dark eyes that suggested she might be exactly what he hadn't dared hope for. "What kind of help did you have in mind, Miss Whitmore?" The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Ezra led his daughters through the tall grass toward the stranger's camp. Sarah clutched his hand with fingers still sticky from the last of their honey, while little Emma rode perched on his shoulders, her small fists tangled in his dark hair. The weight of what he was about to propose sat heavy in his chest, but the memory of Emma's fevered breathing in the night drove him forward. The woman stood beside her horse, checking the cinch on her saddle with practiced efficiency. In daylight, she appeared even more out of place in this wilderness. Her dark traveling dress, though dusty from the trail, was cut from fine cloth, and her boots showed quality craftsmanship beneath the prairie dust. Yet she moved with the confidence of someone who belonged wherever she chose to be. "Ma'am," Ezra called out, stopping a respectful distance away. She turned, and he saw her face clearly for the first time. Strong cheekbones framed dark eyes that held secrets he couldn't fathom, and there was something guarded in her expression that spoke of recent hardship. A purple bruise marred her left temple, mostly hidden by the way she'd arranged her auburn hair. "Mr. Hayes." Her voice carried the cultured tones of Eastern education, mixed with something else, wariness perhaps, or the careful control of someone accustomed to choosing her words with precision. Sarah pressed closer to Ezra's leg, suddenly shy. Emma, however, waved from her perch with the fearless enthusiasm of a 3-year-old. "You're very pretty," Emma announced, causing heat to rise in Ezra's cheeks. A genuine smile flickered across the woman's features, transforming her face entirely. "Why, thank you, little one. You're quite beautiful yourself." "I'm Emma. That's Sarah. She's scared of everything." "I am not," Sarah protested, though she remained firmly attached to her father's pants leg. "It's wise to be cautious," the woman said gently. "There are many things in this world worth being careful of." Something in her tone made Ezra wonder what she was running from, but he pushed the curiosity aside. Everyone had reasons for heading west, and most preferred to keep those reasons private. "Ma'am, I wonder if I might speak with you about a proposition." Her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, shoulders squaring as if preparing for a blow. "What sort of proposition?" Ezra lifted Emma down and knelt between his daughters, drawing them close. The words he'd rehearsed in his head sounded foolish now, but desperation gave him courage. "My girls need proper schooling, and they need—" He struggled for the right words. "They need a woman's guidance, things I can't give them out here no matter how hard I try. And winter's coming hard. Emma's not strong enough for another season in the wilderness." The woman's eyes moved from his face to the girl's, her expression unreadable. "I see. And what exactly are you asking of me?" "Marriage," he said simply, the word hanging in the morning air like smoke from a gun. "Not the usual kind," he added quickly, seeing her stiffen. "A practical arrangement. You'd have protection, a home, security, the girls would have a mother and proper education. I'd ask nothing from you that you weren't willing to give." Sarah looked up at him with wide eyes, while Emma began braiding wildflowers she'd picked from the grass, oblivious to the magnitude of the conversation happening above her head. The woman, he realized he still didn't know her name, was quiet for a long moment, studying them all with those dark, intelligent eyes. "You don't know anything about me," she said finally. "I could be a criminal, a murderer, a woman of ill repute. Are you? Would I tell you if I were?" Ezra considered this. Maybe not. But I've spent years tracking men across this territory, learning to read their intentions. You're running from something, but you're not a killer. And the way you spoke to my daughters just now, there's kindness in you, whether you want to show it or not." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're either very perceptive or very foolish, Mr. Hayes." "Probably both. But I'm also desperate." He pulled Emma closer as she tried to wander toward the woman's horse. "These girls deserve better than what I can give them alone. And you, whatever you're running from, you'll be safer with a ranger than you will be traveling alone. You assume I'm traveling alone by necessity rather than choice. The bruise on your temple suggests it wasn't entirely your choice." Her hand moved instinctively toward her face, then stopped. For a moment, her carefully maintained composure cracked, and he saw fear flicker in her eyes before she composed herself again. "I'll need time to consider your offer." "Of course. But, ma'am, I don't even know your name." She hesitated, as if even this simple information was dangerous to share. "Catherine," she said finally. "Catherine Morrison." "Well then, Miss Morrison." "Mrs." she corrected quietly, and something in her voice told him that was part of her story too. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley floor as Eliza watched Jacob Harper prepare for another patrol. 3 days had passed since their arrangement began, and she'd learned his routines with the careful attention of someone accustomed to survival. He rose before dawn, checked on his daughters, then spent an hour cleaning and loading his weapons with methodical precision. Mary and Sarah had taken to following her around the cabin like curious sparrows, their initial shyness melting into cautious fascination. They peppered her with questions about her traveling dress, her carefully arranged hair, and why she spoke differently than the other women they'd known. Eliza found herself charmed by their innocence, even as it reminded her how far she'd fallen from such simple trust. "Miss Eliza," Mary ventured as they gathered eggs from the henhouse, "Papa says you might not stay long. Are you going to leave us too?" The question hit harder than expected. Eliza paused, studying the girl's earnest face. "That depends on many things, sweetheart. But I'm here now." Sarah, barely 5 but wise beyond her years, slipped her small hand into Eliza's. "Mama left and never came back. Papa gets sad when he thinks we don't see." The weight of their trust settled on Eliza's shoulders like a heavy shawl. She'd entered this arrangement thinking only of escape, but these children were weaving themselves into her carefully guarded heart with dangerous ease. Jacob returned at midday, his face grim. He dismounted with the heavy movements of a man carrying bad news, and Eliza felt her stomach tighten with familiar dread. In her experience, men with that expression brought nothing but trouble. "Pack what you can carry," he said without preamble, his voice tight with controlled tension. "We're leaving within the hour. What's happened?" Eliza kept her voice steady, though her mind immediately catalogued escape routes and contingencies. "Comancheros spotted moving through Devil's Canyon, maybe 2 days out. I won't risk them finding this place." He was already moving, gathering supplies with practiced efficiency. "There's an old mission about 15 miles south. Stone walls, good water. We can fort up there until they pass through." Eliza's pulse quickened. Comancheros meant lawless men who traded with hostile tribes, dealing in weapons, whiskey, and sometimes slaves. But they also meant chaos, distraction, possible opportunities for someone wanting to disappear completely. She pushed the thought away, disturbed by her own calculating nature. "Girls, you heard your father," she called, her voice taking on an authority that surprised them all. "Mary, gather your sister's clothes. Sarah, help me pack the food stores." Jacob paused in his preparations, watching her take charge with something like approval in his eyes. "You've done this before." It wasn't a question. Eliza met his gaze steadily. "I've learned to adapt quickly to changing circumstances." The unspoken understanding passed between them. They both carried secrets, both knew what it meant to run. But where his running was toward duty and protection, hers had always been away from consequences and entanglements. Until now. They made good time across the rough country, Jacob leading with military precision while Eliza kept the girls calm and distracted with stories and songs. She found herself genuinely concerned for their safety, not just as part of her bargain, but because somewhere in the past 3 days their welfare had become real to her. The mission ruins rose from the desert like broken teeth, crumbling adobe walls surrounding a courtyard where wild grass grew between fallen stones. Jacob surveyed the defensible positions with a soldier's eye, while Eliza assessed it with a gambler's instinct for reading situations. "It's isolated," she observed, helping Sarah down from her horse. "If trouble comes, there's nowhere to run." "Sometimes the best defense is making a stand," Jacob replied, but she caught him glancing at his daughters, with worry etched deep in the lines around his eyes. As they settled into the mission's most intact building, Eliza found herself studying Jacob Harper with new attention. He moved with quiet competence, checking sightlines and organizing their meager supplies. But beneath his controlled exterior, she sensed the weight of responsibility that never left him, the constant fear of failing the two people who mattered most. That evening, as the girls slept wrapped in blankets near their small fire, Jacob sat watch by the doorway. Eliza approached quietly, settling beside him without invitation. "You don't have to do this," he said softly, not looking at her. "When morning comes, you could take a horse and be gone before any trouble finds us. I'd understand." Eliza stared out at the star-filled sky, wrestling with impulses she didn't fully understand. The practical voice in her head whispered of opportunities and self-preservation, but another voice, one she'd thought long silenced, spoke of loyalty and belonging. "I made a bargain," she said finally. "I honor my agreements." Jacob turned to study her profile in the firelight. "Even when it might cost you everything?" She met his eyes, seeing her own fears reflected there. Especially then. The morning air carried the scent of sage and wood smoke as Sarah stood at the edge of the camp, watching the sun paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and crimson. She'd risen before dawn, unable to sleep for the 3rd night running. The weight of her deception sat heavy in her chest, but not as heavy as the memory of little Mary's fevered face the night before. Behind her she could hear Thomas moving about the camp with practiced efficiency, his boots crunching softly on the frost-covered ground. The man never seemed to rest, always tending to something, checking the horses, mending gear, watching the horizon with those sharp grey eyes that missed nothing, almost nothing. "Coffee's ready," his voice came from behind her, low and rough from sleep. Sarah turned to find him holding 2 tin cups, steam rising between them like small ghosts in the cold air. She accepted the cup gratefully, their fingers brushing for the briefest moment. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through her, and she pulled back quickly. "Thank you." She wrapped her hands around the warm metal, using it as much for comfort as for warmth. "How is Mary this morning?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "Fever broke sometime in the night. She's sleeping peaceful now." He paused, studying Sarah's face in the growing light. "That poultice you made, where'd you learn to do that?" The question she'd been dreading. Sarah took a sip of the bitter coffee, buying herself time. "My grandmother. She had a way with healing. The lie came easier than it should have, but it was built on a foundation of truth. Helena Ashworth had indeed known herbs, though she'd learned them from the finest physicians money could buy, not from some frontier grandmother. Your grandmother teach you to read too? Sarah's cup froze halfway to her lips. She'd made a mistake somewhere, revealed too much. Some, she said carefully. Why do you ask? Saw you looking at Emma's book last night. The way your lips moved, you weren't just looking at the pictures. His gaze was steady, probing. Most folks out here can't read much beyond their own name. I'm not most folks. The words came out sharper than she intended, carrying more of Helena's imperious tone than Sarah's carefully constructed persona. Something shifted in Thomas's expression, not suspicion exactly, but a new awareness. No, he said quietly. I'm beginning to see that you're not." The moment stretched between them, fragile as spun glass. Sarah felt exposed, as if those grey eyes could see straight through to all her secrets. She was about to speak, to deflect or lie, or simply walk away, when Emma's voice cut through the tension. "Pa! Pa! Come quick!" They both spun toward the wagon where Emma stood in her nightgown, her face pale with worry. Thomas was moving before Sarah could blink, his long strides eating up the distance. Sarah followed, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What is it, little bird?" Thomas had already swung himself up into the wagon bed. "It's Mary. She won't wake up proper. She's talking, but not to us." Sarah climbed up beside them to find Mary sitting upright, her eyes open but unfocused, her lips moving in what sounded like conversation with someone who wasn't there. The fever might have broken, but something else was wrong. "Mary, sweetheart." Thomas's voice was gentle but urgent. "Can you hear Papa?" The little girl's gaze drifted past him as if he were made of air. "Yes, Mama," she whispered to the empty space beside her. "I know you're waiting, but Emma needs me here." Sarah's blood ran cold. She'd seen this before, though never in a child so young. The fever had passed, but it had taken something with it, or perhaps opened a door that should have remained closed. "Thomas," she said quietly, catching his arm, "we need to get her to a real doctor. Soon. Nearest town with a doctor is 3 days hard riding." His voice was steady, but Sarah could see the fear lurking in his eyes. "She can't travel like this." Sarah made a decision that would change everything, though she didn't know it yet. "There's another way," she heard herself say. "But you have to trust me completely." Thomas looked at her then, really looked, and Sarah saw the moment he made his own impossible choice. "What do you need?" "My saddlebags and privacy." She met his gaze steadily. "What I'm about to do, if anyone asks, you know nothing about it." "Sarah, do you want to save your daughter or not?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with consequences neither could foresee. In the distance, a hawk cried out, and Mary continued her one-sided conversation with ghosts. Thomas nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Tell me what to do." The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as Eliza emerged from the cabin, her dark hair pinned severely back and her borrowed dress hanging loose on her frame. She'd barely slept. Haunted by memories, the sight of Jack's grief had stirred to life. The way his shoulders had shaken reminded her too much of another man's tears in another life she'd tried desperately to forget. Jack stood by the corral, watching his daughters attempt to saddle their mare. Mary struggled with the heavy leather, while Beth held the horse's bridle, whispering gentle words to keep the animal calm. Neither girl seemed to notice their father's watchful presence, but Eliza caught the way his hands twitched, wanting to help but forcing himself to remain still. "They're stronger than you think," she said quietly, approaching him. He glanced at her, his eyes still red-rimmed from the previous night. "Sarah always said the same thing, told me I worried too much, that I'd smother them if I wasn't careful." She was right. Eliza leaned against the fence rail, studying the girls. "Mary has your stubbornness. Watch how she won't give up on that cinch strap, even though her arms are shaking." A ghost of a smile crossed Jack's weathered face. "And Beth, she has your heart. See how she talks to that mare? She knows exactly what that animal needs to hear." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the girls work. When Mary finally managed to secure the saddle, both daughters turned toward their father with identical grins of triumph. Jack's expression softened in a way that made Eliza's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "We did it, Papa!" Beth called out, bouncing on her toes. "I can see that, little bird. You two make quite a team." Mary beamed at the praise, but her expression grew serious as she noticed Eliza. "Miss Catherine, do you know how to ride?" The question caught Eliza off guard. In her previous life, she'd owned horses worth more than most men saw in a year. She'd ridden side-saddle through Central Park and astride across her family's estate when no one was watching. But Catherine Morse would have no such luxuries in her past. "Some," she answered carefully, "though it's been a while." "Papa could teach you." Beth suggested with the innocent enthusiasm of childhood. He taught Mama, and she said he was real patient, even when she fell off 3 times in one afternoon. Jack's face flushed slightly. Beth, I'm sure Miss Catherine has her own— Actually, Eliza interrupted, surprising herself, I'd welcome the instruction. If you have the time to spare. Something shifted in Jack's expression, a flicker of interest that went beyond mere politeness. I reckon we could start this afternoon. The old gelding's gentle enough for learning. As the morning progressed, Eliza found herself drawn into the rhythm of ranch life. She helped the girls with their morning chores, mended a tear in Mary's skirt, and assisted with preparing the midday meal. Each task felt like stepping into someone else's skin, playing a role she'd never imagined for herself. But it was during the quiet moments that the real challenge emerged. When Jack brushed against her while reaching for the coffee pot, when his eyes lingered on her face as she read to the girls, when his voice grew soft speaking her assumed name. The attraction she'd sensed the night before hadn't diminished with daylight. If anything, it had grown stronger, more dangerous. She was clearing the lunch dishes when riders appeared on the horizon. Jack tensed immediately, his hand moving instinctively to his sidearm before he recognized the approaching figures. "Sheriff Morrison," he called out as the 3 men rode into the yard. "What brings you out this way?" The sheriff, a grizzled man with steel-grey hair, dismounted slowly. His deputies remained mounted, their eyes scanning the property with professional interest. "Afternoon, Jack. We're tracking some folks who might have passed through these parts. Bank robbery up in Silver Creek, and the trail leads south." Eliza's blood turned to ice, but she forced herself to continue stacking plates with steady hands. Through the window she watched Jack's face, searching for any sign that he suspected her. "Haven't seen any strangers," Jack replied easily. "Just me and the girls out here." "What about her?" One of the deputies nodded toward the cabin. "That's not Mrs. Holloway." "My wife passed last winter," Jack said, his voice carrying just the right note of grief. "This is Miss Catherine Morse. She's helping with the children." Sheriff Morrison's gaze sharpened with interest. "That so? Where you from, miss?" Eliza stepped onto the porch, praying her voice would remain steady. "Kansas, Sheriff. I answered Mr. Holloway's advertisement for a governess. Long way to travel for work. Sometimes a person needs a fresh start." She met his eyes directly, banking on the truth in those words to carry her through the lie. The sheriff studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Well, if you see anything unusual, Jack, you know where to find me." As the riders disappeared into the distance, Eliza realized her hands were trembling. The life she'd tried to leave behind was closer than she'd hoped. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as Clara watched Samuel demonstrate proper rifle stance to Emma. The 11-year-old's concentration was absolute, her small hands gripping the weapon with surprising steadiness. Behind them, Lucy sat cross-legged in the dirt, fashioning dolls from corn husks with scraps of fabric Clara had provided. "Breathe out slow, then squeeze," Samuel instructed, his weathered hands guiding Emma's positioning. The crack of the rifle split the air, sending a tin can spinning off the fence post. "I did it!" Emma's whoop of joy carried across the yard, and Clara found herself smiling despite the knot of unease in her stomach. 3 weeks had passed since her arrival, and the girls had begun to accept her presence with cautious warmth. Lucy, especially, seemed starved for feminine attention, following Clara around the kitchen and asking endless questions about cooking, sewing, and the mysterious rituals of womanhood that lay ahead. Emma remained more reserved, but Clara caught her watching sometimes with curiosity rather than suspicion. Samuel, however, had grown increasingly distant. Where their first days had been marked by tentative conversations over meals and shared glances across the cabin, now he spoke only when necessary. He rose before dawn, worked until exhaustion claimed him, and collapsed into his bedroll by the fire without so much as a good night. Clara slept in the small back room that had once belonged to his wife, surrounded by the ghost of another woman's life. She told herself his coldness was a relief, The less entangled they became, the easier it would be when the time came to leave. Because despite the growing warmth she felt for the girls, despite the strange sense of rightness she experienced in this simple domestic life, she knew it couldn't last. Men like Silas Callahan didn't simply vanish because their quarry found a hiding place. They circled like wolves, patient and deadly, until the moment came to strike. "Miss Clara, will you braid my hair like yours?" Lucy's voice pulled her from dark thoughts. The child stood beside her, corn-husk doll clutched in one small fist. "Of course, sweetheart." Clara settled onto the porch step, gathering Lucy between her knees. As her fingers worked through the girl's fine brown hair, she became aware of Samuel's gaze upon them. When she looked up, his expression was unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes before he turned away. "Tell me about the lady who lived here before," Lucy said suddenly. "The one whose dresses hang in the wardrobe." Clara's hands stilled. In all their conversations, Samuel's deceased wife had remained an unspoken presence, her belongings undisturbed, her memory hovering over the household like morning mist. "That was your mother, Lucy. She must have been very special. I don't remember her much, just her voice sometimes, singing. Emma says she was beautiful. I'm sure she was." Clara resumed braiding, her throat tight. "What was her name?" "Sarah. Papa doesn't like to talk about her." From across the yard, Samuel's voice cut through the morning air. "Emma, that's enough practice. Help me check the south fence." As father and daughter walked toward the corral, Clara caught fragments of their conversation on the wind. Emma's voice, earnest and questioning, followed by Samuel's deeper tones, though she couldn't make out the words. Whatever they discussed left Emma glancing back toward the house with a troubled expression. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors. Clara was hanging laundry when she spotted riders approaching from the east. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized the purposeful way they moved, the careful formation that spoke of men accustomed to hunting. For one terrifying moment she thought Callahan had found her, but as they drew closer, she realized these were different men entirely. Samuel emerged from the barn, rifle in hand but held low. The lead rider was a lean man with silver at his temples and a star pinned to his vest, a lawman. "Sheriff Morrison," Samuel called out, his tone carefully neutral. "What brings you out this way?" The sheriff's gaze swept the ranch, taking in the domestic scene before settling on Clara. His expression was polite but assessing, the look of a man accustomed to reading truth from faces. "Heard you'd taken a wife, Sam. Thought I'd ride out and pay my respects." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Been some interesting developments in Prescott lately. Strange stories filtering in from down south." Clara forced herself to remain still, continuing to hang shirts and petticoats as though the conversation held no interest for her, but every muscle in her body was coiled, ready for flight. "Stories have a way of growing in the telling," Samuel replied evenly. "Coffee's on if you and your men want to rest your horses." The invitation was proper, expected, but Clara heard the reluctance beneath it. Samuel's jaw was tight, his knuckles white where they gripped the rifle stock. Sheriff Morrison's smile widened, showing teeth like a wolf's. "Much obliged, Sam. Been a long ride, and I find myself curious about your new bride." The morning mist clung to the valley floor like smoke from a dying campfire as Caleb saddled his horse in the pre-dawn darkness. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, though his mind churned with unease. The tracks he'd found yesterday led northwest, toward the Badlands where decent folk didn't venture without good reason. 3 sets of boot prints, all heading in the same direction as the stolen cattle. "You're leaving early." Evelyn's voice came soft from the cabin doorway, startling him from his thoughts. He glanced up to see her silhouetted against the warm glow spilling from inside. She'd taken to rising before the girls, he'd noticed, always ensuring breakfast was ready and the day's lessons planned. It was more consideration than he'd dared hope for when he'd made his desperate proposition weeks ago. "Trail's getting cold," he said, checking the rifle in his saddle boot. "These rustlers know the country well enough to disappear if I don't press them." She stepped closer, her bare feet soundless on the packed earth. In the pale light, he could see she wore only her nightgown beneath a hastily donned shawl. The sight stirred something in him that he quickly pushed aside. "How long will you be gone?" There was something in her voice he couldn't quite place. Concern, perhaps. Or was it fear? 2 days, maybe 3. He paused in his preparations. "You'll be safe here. The neighbors know to check on you. And there's the shotgun behind the door if... I'm not worried about myself." She pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "The girls ask questions when you're away, about their mother, about before I came. I don't know what to tell them." Caleb's hands stilled on the saddle horn. Sarah had begun asking about her mother more frequently, and little Emma seemed to sense the undercurrents of adult conversation even when the words themselves escaped her understanding. "Tell them what you think they need to hear," he said finally. "You know them well enough now." "Do I?" Evelyn stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender soap on her skin. "Sometimes I feel like I'm play-acting at being their mother, like I'm wearing clothes that don't quite fit." The vulnerability in her confession caught him off guard. In the weeks since their arrangement began, she'd been nothing if not capable. She'd taken to frontier life with a determination that had impressed him, never complaining about the isolation or the endless work that came with running a household this far from civilization. "You're doing better than play-acting," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "They trust you. That's not something that comes easy to children who've lost so much." She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the growing light. "What happens when this arrangement runs its course, Caleb? When the year is up and I've fulfilled my part of the bargain?" The question hung between them like smoke from a gun barrel. It was something he'd been trying not to think about as the weeks passed, and she became more integral to their daily lives. The girls had stopped asking when Miss Evelyn was going home. Somewhere along the way, this had become home. "I suppose that depends," he said carefully, "on whether you want to stay. And if I do," her voice was barely above a whisper, "what then?" Before he could answer, the cabin door creaked open and Sarah appeared, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Papa, are you leaving again?" The spell between them broke. Evelyn stepped back, her expression shuddering as she turned toward the child. "Come inside, sweetheart. Let's get you dressed and fed while your father finishes his preparations." Sarah ran to him for a hug, and he lifted her easily, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair. "I'll be back soon, little bird. You mind Miss Evelyn while I'm gone?" "I always do," Sarah said solemnly. "She teaches me things Mama never did, like how to make bread that doesn't taste like rocks." Over his daughter's head, Caleb caught Evelyn's small smile at the backhanded compliment to her predecessor. It struck him then how seamlessly she'd filled the empty spaces in their lives, not trying to replace Margaret, but creating something entirely new. He set Sarah down and watched them disappear into the cabin together, their voices mixing with Emma's sleepy chatter. The domesticity of the scene should have comforted him, but instead it only deepened his unease. He was growing too attached, letting himself imagine futures that might not be possible. As he swung into the saddle and pointed his horse toward the rising sun, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger wasn't waiting for him in the Badlands. It was right here, in the way his heart had begun to hope for things he'd thought buried with his first wife. The trails ahead would test more than his tracking skills. They would determine whether the arrangement that had saved his family might ultimately destroy it. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Eliza watched Samuel teach the girls to track deer prints in the soft earth near the creek. His patience with them had surprised her from the beginning, but seeing him now, crouched between Lucy and Beth as he pointed out the subtle differences between fresh and old signs, something twisted in her chest that had nothing to do with her past. "Miss Eliza!" Lucy called out, waving her over. "Come see what we found!" She approached cautiously, still unused to being included in their small rituals. Samuel glanced up at her, and for a moment their eyes held. The wariness that had defined their early weeks together had begun to soften into something more complicated, more dangerous. "Fresh prints," he said, his voice gruff. "Buck, by the size of them. Passed through here just after dawn." Eliza knelt beside them, close enough to catch the scent of leather and wood smoke that seemed to follow Samuel everywhere. "How can you tell when?" "The edges," Beth piped up proudly. "Papa taught us. See how sharp they are? Rain would make them soft, and time would fill them with leaves." The simple pride in the child's voice made Eliza's throat tight. These girls, who had known such loss, were learning to read the world around them with the confidence of those who belonged somewhere. She envied them that certainty. Samuel stood, dusting off his knees. "We'll follow the trail a ways. Good practice for them." They moved through the forest in single file, Samuel leading, the girls between them, and Eliza bringing up the rear. She found herself studying the line of Samuel's shoulders, the easy way he moved through terrain that would challenge most men. There was something elemental about him out here, as if the wilderness had shaped him as much as he'd learned to shape it. When they paused at a clearing where the trail split, Lucy tugged on her father's sleeve. "Papa, which way?" Samuel examined both paths, then looked back at Eliza. "What do you think?" The question caught her off guard. In Boston, in the world she'd fled, men had rarely asked her opinion on matters they considered their domain. I wouldn't know. Look at the ground. What do you see?" She studied the earth, trying to apply what she'd observed him teaching the girls. On the left path, the soil looked disturbed but old. On the right, she could make out what might have been the edge of a hoofprint. The right path, something that might have been approval, flickered in his eyes. "Why? The disturbance looks fresher, and—" She hesitated, then pressed on. The deer would want higher ground to see predators coming. "Good." The simple word warmed her more than it should have. They followed the right path up a gentle slope until it opened onto a ridge overlooking the valley. The view stretched for miles, rolling hills covered in autumn gold and deep green, with their cabin visible as a small dot near the glinting thread of the creek. "It's beautiful," Eliza breathed, meaning it. Samuel moved to stand beside her. "This country either breaks you or becomes part of you. There's no middle ground." She heard the question in his words, felt the weight of his attention. "And the girls, what will it do to them? Make them strong? Stronger than they would have been back east, hiding behind parlor walls and pretty manners?" There was an edge to his voice that made her look at him more closely. "You don't approve of Eastern ways?" "I don't approve of lies dressed up as civilization." His jaw tightened. "Out here things are what they are. A wolf is a wolf, a storm is a storm. No pretending otherwise." The words hit closer to home than he could know. Eliza had built her life on pretending, on being someone other than who she truly was. The irony of standing here, playing at being a governess and frontier woman, while her real identity remained buried beneath layers of carefully constructed deception, was not lost on her. "Papa, look!" Beth called from the far edge of the ridge. "There's the buck!" They all turned to see the animal standing motionless about 50 yards away, a magnificent creature with a full rack of antlers. It studied them with dark, intelligent eyes, unafraid but alert. "Why doesn't it run?" Lucy whispered. "Because we're not hunting," Samuel replied quietly. "It knows the difference." The buck held their gaze for another long moment, then turned and disappeared into the trees with fluid grace. As they made their way back down the ridge, Eliza found herself thinking about the deer's ability to sense intention, to know when it was safe and when it wasn't. She wondered what Samuel would see if he looked at her with that same wild intuition, whether he would recognize the predator hidden beneath her careful facade. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, walking behind this man who was becoming dangerously important to her, she found herself wishing he would look deep enough to see the truth, and somehow, impossibly, choose not to run. The morning light filtered through the cabin windows like spun gold, but Eliza barely noticed. As she worked at the wash basin, her movements mechanical and distant. 3 days had passed since Jacob's revelation about her bounty, 3 days of careful politeness and measured words between them. The easy rhythm they'd found seemed fractured now, replaced by an awkwardness that made even simple conversations feel treacherous. "Miss Eliza, you're scrubbing that plate clean through to China." Sarah's voice broke through her reverie. Eliza startled, realizing she'd been washing the same tin plate for several minutes. "Oh, She set it aside with shaking hands. "I suppose my mind was elsewhere." Mary looked up from where she sat, mending a torn dress. At 13, she possessed an unsettling ability to read the currents between adults. "Papa's been chopping wood since before dawn. That's the third cord this week." Through the window, they could indeed hear the steady rhythm of Jakob's axe biting into timber. He'd been throwing himself into physical labor with an intensity that spoke of inner turmoil, rising before the sun and working until exhaustion forced him to stop. "Men work through their troubles differently than women," Eliza said carefully, though her own troubles felt like lead weights in her chest. "Is Papa troubled about you leaving?" Sarah asked with the directness only children possessed. The question hit Eliza like a physical blow. She hadn't spoken of leaving, but perhaps her growing distance had made it obvious. "I haven't said anything about leaving." "But you're thinking it," Mary observed. "You get the same look Mama had before she told us we had to move again, like you're already gone even though you're still here." Eliza's throat tightened. She'd forgotten how perceptive children could be, how they absorbed the unspoken tensions that adults thought they were hiding. Sometimes people think about many things. That doesn't mean they'll act on all of them. The axe blows outside stopped abruptly, and moments later Jacob appeared in the doorway, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cool morning air. His eyes found Eliza's briefly before skittering away. "Thought I'd ride to town today," he said, addressing the room rather than anyone specifically. "We need supplies, and there might be news." The word news hung in the air between them, loaded with implication. News about her, about bounty hunters, about the danger that seemed to follow her like a shadow. "I'll come with you," Eliza said before she could think better of it. Jacob's surprise was evident. "That might not be wise. Hiding here won't change anything. If someone's looking for me, they'll look whether I cower in this cabin or not." "It's not cowering, it's being smart. Is it? Or is it just another kind of prison?" The girls watched this exchange with wide eyes, sensing the deeper currents beneath their words. Jakob ran a hand through his dark hair, leaving it disheveled. "We'll all go," he decided. "Make it a family outing. Less suspicious that way." The word family sent an unexpected pang through Eliza's chest. When had she started thinking of them that way? When had these walls begun to feel like home rather than temporary shelter? An hour later, they were rattling toward town in Jakob's wagon, the girls chattering excitedly about seeing their friends and maybe getting peppermint sticks. Eliza sat beside Jacob on the driver's bench, acutely aware of every brush of his shoulder against hers as the wagon swayed. "Eliza," he said quietly, his voice meant for her alone. "About what I told you. You did what you thought was right. I understand that. Do you? Because you've been looking at me like I betrayed you." She turned to study his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the weathered hands holding the reins. "Haven't you? In a way?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I've been asking myself that same question for 3 days. I keep coming back to the same answer, which is that I'd rather have you angry and alive than trusting and dead." The simple honesty in his words undid something tight in her chest. "And I'd rather you see me as I am than as some ideal you've created. I'm not the woman you think I am, Jakob. You're exactly the woman I think you are. That's what scares the hell out of me." Before she could ask what he meant, Sarah's excited voice called out from behind them. "Look, there's the church spire." Millfield spread before them, a collection of wooden buildings that seemed to huddle together against the vast emptiness of the plains. As they rolled down the main street, Eliza felt the familiar tension that came with exposure, with being seen. But beside her, Jacob's presence felt solid and reassuring, a reminder that she wasn't facing this alone, at least not yet. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon for days finally broke just as Elena finished mending Sarah's torn dress. Thunder rolled across the prairie like cannon fire, and rain began pelting the cabin's roof with increasing fury. She set down her needle and moved to the window, watching the lightning illuminate the darkening landscape in stark, violent flashes. "Will Papa make it home before it gets worse?" Sarah asked from where she sat reading by the fire, her voice tight with worry. Elena forced a reassuring smile. "Your father has weathered storms far worse than this one. He'll find shelter and wait it out if he needs to." But even as she spoke the words, her own anxiety gnawed at her chest. Marcus had been gone 3 days tracking rustlers, and the weather had turned treacherous. Mary looked up from her arithmetic slate, her young face creased with concern. The horses sound scared. Through the howling wind, Elena could indeed hear the animals in the small barn behind the cabin, their frightened whinnies barely audible above the storm's rage. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and moved toward the door. "Where are you going?" Sarah asked, rising quickly from her chair. "To check on them. They need to know they're not alone. But the storm will pass." Elena's hand was already on the latch. "Keep the fire burning and stay inside. I'll be back in a few minutes." The moment she stepped outside, the wind nearly knocked her sideways. Rain lashed her face like tiny whips, and the world disappeared into a wall of water and darkness. She bent her head against the gale and fought her way toward the barn, her boots slipping in the rapidly forming mud. Inside the barn, the horses were restless and wild-eyed. Marcus's mare, Belle, paced her stall, while the old gelding they used for farm work pressed himself against the far wall, trembling. Elena spoke to them in low, soothing tones, the same voice she'd once used to calm frightened children in the orphanage, when thunderstorms raged through Chicago's streets. "Easy now," she murmured, stroking Belle's neck. "It's just noise and water. It can't hurt you here." A tremendous crack of thunder shook the entire structure, followed immediately by a flash of lightning so bright it turned the barn white as noon for an instant. In that moment of illumination, Elena saw something that made her blood freeze. 3 figures on horseback were approaching through the storm, their silhouettes dark and menacing against the lightning-split sky. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed herself against the barn wall, peering through a gap between the wooden planks. The riders moved with purpose, not seeking shelter but clearly heading directly for the cabin. In the next flash of lightning, she caught sight of their leader's face and nearly cried out. It was him, the man she'd fled from in Denver, the one whose reach she'd thought couldn't extend this far into the wilderness. Thomas Blackwood had found her. Elena's mind raced as she watched the 3 men dismount near the cabin's front porch. Through the storm, she could see Sarah's silhouette moving past the window, oblivious to the danger approaching. There was no way to reach the cabin without crossing open ground, no way to warn the girls without exposing herself. But she couldn't let them face Blackwood alone. She grabbed a pitchfork from against the barn wall, her hands shaking not from cold but from the memories that crashed over her like the storm itself. The last time she'd seen that man, he'd promised her that running would only make things worse when he eventually found her. He'd been right about finding her, but Elena was no longer the terrified woman who'd fled Denver in the dead of night. These girls had become her family. This place had become her home. And she would die before she let Blackwood destroy either. The wind masked her movement as she crept from the barn toward the cabin's rear entrance. Through the kitchen window, she could see Sarah helping Mary bank the fire, their movements calm and unsuspecting. Elena's throat tightened with fierce protectiveness. A loud knock echoed from the front door, somehow audible even above the storm's fury. Elena saw both girls freeze, then look toward the door with confusion rather than fear. They were expecting their father, not understanding that sometimes wolves came disguised as men seeking shelter. Elena reached the back door just as she heard Blackwood's voice calling out, smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "Hello, the house, travelers seeking refuge from the storm." Sarah's voice carried back, polite and welcoming as Marcus had taught her to be with strangers in need. "Just a moment, please." Elena burst through the back door just as Sarah's hand reached for the front latch, her voice sharp with urgency. "Don't open that door." Both girls spun toward her, eyes wide with alarm at her tone. Outside, the knocking stopped abruptly, and Elena knew with sick certainty that Blackwood had heard her voice. The hunt was over, the reckoning had begun. The storm hit without warning, turning the afternoon sky black as coal and unleashing sheets of rain that hammered the cabin roof like rifle fire. Elias pressed his face against the window, watching lightning split the darkness while thunder shook the walls. Inside, the warmth felt fragile against nature's fury. "Papa, I'm scared," Lucy whispered, clutching her doll tight against her chest. "It's just noise, little bird," he murmured. But his eyes found Vera across the room where she sat mending one of Sarah's dresses. Something in her posture had changed the moment the storm began, a tension that went beyond the weather. The wind howled through the gaps in the logs, making the lantern flames dance. Sarah huddled closer to Vera, who set down her needle and wrapped an arm around the girl's shoulders. Even in the dim light, Elias could see the way Vera's hands trembled. "Tell us a story, Miss Vera," Sarah pleaded. "Something happy." Vera's smile looked forced. "I don't know many happy stories, sweetheart." "Then Papa can tell one," Lucy declared, scrambling onto Elias's lap. "Tell the one about the princess and the dragon." As Elias spun his tale, weaving together fragments of fairy tales and frontier legends, he kept watching Vera. She stared into the fire with the same haunted expression he'd seen the night she first arrived, as if the storm had awakened ghosts she'd fought to keep buried. When the girls finally fell asleep in their bed, the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by rain against the windows and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. Vera hadn't moved from her chair, hadn't spoken since the story ended. "You all right?" Elias asked softly. She startled as if she'd forgotten he was there. "Fine, just tired." But she wasn't fine. In the firelight, her face looked pale as winter frost, and her breathing came too quick and shallow. When lightning flashed again, illuminating the cabin in stark white, she flinched like she'd been struck. "Vera." He moved closer, lowering his voice so he wouldn't wake the children. "What is it?" "Nothing. It's nothing." She stood abruptly, smoothing her skirts. "I should check on the girls." She was running again, he realized. Not physically this time, but retreating into herself the way she had those first weeks. The progress they'd made, the laughter, the stolen glances, the moment when she'd almost let him kiss her, it all seemed to crumble as another thunderclap shook the cabin. "They're fine," he said gently. "But you're not." "I said I'm fine." Her voice carried an edge sharp enough to cut. "Don't push me, Elias. Not tonight." But he couldn't let her disappear into whatever darkness held her. These past months had shown him glimpses of the woman beneath the fear, and he'd grown to care for that woman more than was wise, more than was safe. "Talk to me," he said. "Please." She whirled to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You want to know? It was a night like this. The storm, the thunder, all of it. That's when Charles—" her voice broke. "When he showed me what kind of monster I'd married, what kind of monster I'd become." The admission hung between them like smoke. Elias felt his chest tighten, understanding flooding through him. He'd suspected Charles Morrison had hurt her, but seeing her like this, seeing how completely the storm had unraveled her careful composure, made it real in a way that filled him with quiet rage. "You're not a monster," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking very young and very lost. "The things I did to survive, the choices I made. If you knew... I know you saved my daughters when you could have kept running. I know you've sewn their clothes and sung them to sleep and made this place a home when it was just a house full of ghosts." He took a step toward her. "I know you're the bravest woman I've ever met." Lightning flashed again, but this time she didn't flinch. Instead, she looked at him with something raw and vulnerable in her expression. "I killed him," she whispered. "Charles. The last night, when the storm was worst, he came for me with his belt and his fists and his promises to make me pay for every imagined slight. So I picked up the poker from the fireplace and I—" Her breath hitched. "I'm not brave, Elias. I'm a murderer." The words fell into silence, broken only by rain against glass. Elias felt something shift inside his chest, not horror or revulsion, but a fierce protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. She stood before him like a wild thing caught in a trap, waiting for judgment, for condemnation, for him to turn away in disgust. Instead, he closed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon finally broke just after midnight, sending sheets of rain against the cabin walls with a fury that matched the turmoil in Jake's chest. He stood at the window, watching lightning illuminate the yard in stark, momentary flashes, each one revealing the empty space where Helena's horse should have been. She'd been gone 3 days now. Sarah had stopped asking when Helena was coming back, but Jake caught her looking toward the door whenever footsteps sounded on the porch. Even little Emma seemed to sense something was wrong, clinging closer to him during their evening stories, her small fingers gripping his shirt as if afraid he might disappear too. "Pa?" Sarah's voice came soft from the loft above. "Can't sleep with all that thunder." Jake turned from the window, his hand instinctively moving to the letter in his shirt pocket, the one that had arrived that morning from the territorial marshal, the one that confirmed his worst fears about what Helena was running from. "Come on down then, little bird. We'll wait it out together." Sarah's bare feet padded down the ladder, her nightgown ghostly white in the dim lamplight. She settled beside him on the wooden bench, and he wrapped his arm around her narrow shoulders, feeling how much she'd grown in these past months. Helena had been right about that. His daughters were changing, becoming something more than the frightened, half-wild creatures they'd been when she first arrived. "Is she coming back, Pa? Really?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Jake had been asking himself the same thing, replaying their last conversation over and over, the way she'd looked at him when Garrett rode away, like she was already gone, like she was seeing him from a great distance. "I don't know, Sarah. I honestly don't know." Thunder crashed overhead, and Sarah pressed closer to his side. "Mama used to say that storms wash things clean, make room for new beginnings." Jake's throat tightened. "Your mama was a wise woman. Helena's in trouble, isn't she? Real trouble." There was no point in lying. Sarah had inherited too much of her mother's intuition, and she'd seen the fear in Helena's eyes when those men came calling. "Yes, she is. Then why aren't we helping her?" The simple question cut deeper than any blade. Why weren't they? Because she'd asked him not to follow? Because she'd made it clear this was her fight alone? Or because some part of him, the part that had been burned before, was relieved to let her go before she could leave him the way Mary had? Another flash of lightning lit the yard, and this time Jake saw something that made his heart stop. A rider, hunched against the rain, leading a limping horse toward the barn. "Stay here," he commanded Sarah, grabbing his rifle from above the door. But even as he stepped onto the porch, he knew it wasn't Helena. The silhouette was wrong, too broad through the shoulders. The stranger looked up as Jake emerged, rain streaming from the brim of his hat. "You Jake Morrison?" "Depends who's asking." Jake kept the rifle ready, but not quite aimed. "Name's Tom Fletcher. I rode with Helena Vasquez down in New Mexico territory. She sent me." Jake's pulse hammered against his ribs. "She's alive?" "For now." Fletcher dismounted carefully, favoring his left leg. "But Garrett's got her cornered in the old mission ruins about 2 days south of here. She wanted you to know she's sorry about the bargain. Said to tell you she never meant for it to end this way." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. She thought she was going to die. Thought this was goodbye. How many men does Garrett have? 6, maybe 7. All professionals. Fletcher's eyes glinted in the lamplight. "Helena's good, but she can't hold them off forever. That old mission's got too many ways in." Sarah appeared in the doorway despite his orders, her face pale but determined. "You have to go after her, Pa. You have to." Jake looked at his daughter, really looked at her. When had she become so much like her mother, so certain about what was right, even when it meant sacrifice? "Mr. Fletcher, there's a fresh horse in the barn and food in the kitchen." "Sarah, Wake your sister. You're going to Mrs. Patterson's place. Pa, no arguments. This is what families do, little bird. We protect each other, no matter the cost. As he gathered his gear and saddled his horse, Jake thought about bargains and the prices they demanded. He'd made one with Helena to save his daughters from the wilderness. Now he'd make another, with fate, with God, with whatever forces governed this harsh land, to save the woman who'd become more essential to him than breath itself. The storm was breaking as he rode south, but Jake barely noticed. Helena had given him back his family. Now it was time to bring her home. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Sarah stepped onto the porch, her hands trembling as she gripped the letter that had arrived with yesterday's supply wagon. The paper felt like lead in her fingers, bearing news she'd prayed would never come. Behind her, she could hear Emma and Lucy chattering over breakfast, their innocent voices a stark contrast to the storm brewing in her chest. Marcus emerged from the barn, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the golden light. Even from a distance, she could see the contentment in his stride, the way he'd begun to move like a man who'd found his place in the world. The sight of him made her heart clench with both love and devastating guilt. "Sarah?" His voice carried concern as he approached, clearly reading the distress in her posture. "What is it?" She held out the letter wordlessly, watching as his eyes scanned the formal script. His face grew increasingly grave as he read, the color draining from his weathered features. "Cornelius Blackwood," he said finally, the name falling like a curse from his lips. "Your husband?" "Former husband," she corrected, though the words felt hollow. "He's found me, Marcus. After all this time, all these miles." Her voice broke. Marcus crushed the letter in his fist, his jaw working as he processed the implications. The message was clear. Blackwood was coming to reclaim what he considered his property, bringing with him enough men and legal authority to make resistance seem futile. "We'll fight him," Marcus said, but Sarah could hear the uncertainty beneath his determination. "With what? You know as well as I do that men like Cornelius don't make empty threats. He has money, influence, lawyers who'll twist the law to suit his purposes." She sank into one of the porch chairs, suddenly feeling ancient. "I should have known this peace couldn't last." From inside the house came the sound of breaking crockery, followed by Emma's apologetic voice. The normalcy of it struck Sarah like a physical blow. How many more mornings would she have to hear such sounds? How many more chances to braid Lucy's hair or listen to Emma's earnest questions about the world? "There has to be something," Marcus insisted, beginning to pace the length of the porch. "Some legal recourse, some—" "Marcus!" Sarah's quiet voice stopped him mid-stride. "I've been thinking about this all night. There might be a way, but—" She hesitated, knowing her next words would shatter something precious between them. He knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his calloused ones. "Tell me, if I were to disappear before he arrives, simply vanish without a trace. He couldn't touch you or the girls then. You could claim ignorance, say I was just a hired hand who moved on." The suggestion hung between them like a blade. Marcus's grip on her hands tightened to the point of pain. "No." The word came out harsh, final. "I won't lose you again, Sarah. Not like this. You might lose everything if I stay. Your daughters, your ranch, your freedom. Cornelius isn't just ruthless. He's vindictive. He'll destroy anything and anyone connected to me out of pure spite." Marcus stood abruptly, his hands clenching into fists. "Then we run, all of us. Tonight, we take the girls and head north to Montana Territory, maybe Canada, start over where he can't reach us." Sarah's heart ached at the desperate hope in his voice. And what kind of life would that be for Emma and Lucy? Always looking over our shoulders, never able to settle anywhere. They deserve better than that. They deserve the stability you've built here. The morning wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of the approaching autumn. Soon the aspens would turn gold, and the first snows would dust the mountain peaks. It should have been a time of preparation and contentment, of looking forward to cozy winter evenings by the fire. Instead, it felt like the end of everything they'd fought to build. "There's another option," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely audible above the wind. "One you won't like." Marcus turned back to her, his expression guarded. "I could go to him willingly, negotiate terms. If I return without a fight, he might be satisfied enough to leave you alone." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stared at her as if she'd suggested setting fire to the house. "Sarah Hartwell," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "If you think for one moment I'd let you sacrifice yourself to that monster, you don't know me at all." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses reached their ears. Both of them froze, hearts hammering, until they recognized the familiar figure of Sheriff McKenna cresting the hill. Behind him rode two men Sarah didn't recognize, their badges glinting in the morning sun. "Federal marshals," Marcus observed grimly. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the last of their borrowed time slipping away like sand through her fingers. Cornelius's reach was longer than she'd imagined, his timing more precise than she'd feared. The reckoning had begun. The dawn broke cold and merciless over the canyon rim, painting the rocks in shades of blood and gold. Elena stood at the cabin window, watching the dust cloud on the horizon grow larger with each passing minute. Her fingers traced the glass, leaving ghost prints that caught the early light. "How many?" Marcus asked from behind her, his voice steady despite the tension coiled in his shoulders. 20, maybe more. She didn't turn around. Valdez never was one for subtlety. The girls huddled near the fireplace, Sarah clutching her younger sister, while Mary pressed close to both of them. They'd heard enough of the hushed conversations to understand that danger was riding toward their sanctuary, but Elena had been careful to keep the worst details from reaching their ears. Marcus checked his rifle for the third time, the metallic clicks echoing in the small space. "The cache is well hidden?" "Hidden enough." Elena finally faced him, her dark eyes holding secrets and sorrows he was only beginning to understand. "But if they take this place apart stone by stone..." She didn't need to finish. They both knew what Valdez would do if he found even a tenth of the stolen fortune that had bought Elena's freedom and condemned her to a life of running. More than that, they knew what he'd do to anyone who'd helped her hide it. "There's still time," Marcus said quietly. "You could take the horses, head north. I'll tell him you were never here." The look she gave him could have melted steel. "You think I'd run? Leave you and the girls to face what's coming? It's not your fight, Elena, isn't it?" She moved closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. "When did this stop being about our arrangement, Marcus? When did it become about something else entirely?" He wanted to tell her it had stopped being just an arrangement the first time he'd seen her reading to his daughters, her voice gentle as she spun tales of faraway places. Or maybe it was when she'd stayed up all night nursing Sarah through fever, never once complaining about the burden she'd taken on. Perhaps it was simply the way she looked at him sometimes, as if seeing not just the desperate widower who'd made an impossible bargain, but the man he used to be before grief and duty had worn him down to bone and sinew. Instead, he reached for her hand. "When you stopped being a stranger." The dust cloud was close enough now to make out individual riders. Valdez rode at the front, his silver-adorned jacket catching the morning sun like armor. Even from a distance, Elena could see the cruel set of his shoulders, the predatory way he surveyed the land before him as if everything in sight already belonged to him. "He'll want to talk first," she said, pulling her hand free to check the derringer hidden in her skirt. "Men like Valdez, they enjoy the moment before they strike. It feeds something in them. Good. That gives us time." "Time for what?" "Marcus, you're one man with one rifle against 20 killers who've been riding hard for days. This isn't some romanticized notion of frontier justice. These men will gut you like a fish and make me watch before they drag me back to face whatever hell Valdez has planned." Sarah whispered something to Mary, and both girls looked toward their father with wide, frightened eyes. Marcus crossed to them, kneeling down to their level. "Remember what we practiced," he said softly. "If things go badly, you take the tunnel Elena showed you. You don't look back, you don't wait for anyone. You run until you reach the Hendersons' place, and you tell them what happened." "Papa!" "No," Sarah's voice broke. "We won't leave you." "You will," he said firmly. Then his voice gentled. "Because that's what your mama would have wanted. And because Elena and I need to know you're safe so we can do what we have to do." Elena watched this exchange with something twisting in her chest, a pain she'd thought herself too hardened to feel anymore. These people had become her family without her realizing it, had slipped past defenses she'd spent years building. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd fled one kind of bondage only to discover another, sweeter kind, that she had no desire to escape. The riders were close enough now to hear their voices, rough laughter carrying on the wind. Valdez had stopped his men just beyond rifle range, but close enough to make his presence felt like a weight pressing down on the canyon. "Well," Elena said, smoothing her skirts and checking that her hair was properly pinned, "I suppose it's time to see if the devil himself remembers his manners when calling on a lady." Marcus stood, rifle in hand, and together they stepped out onto the porch to face whatever reckoning the sunrise had brought them. The gunshots echoed across the valley like thunder, and Caleb's blood ran cold as he counted them. Too many, too close to the cabin. He spurred his horse harder, the animal's hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth as pine trees blurred past. Behind him, Doc Morrison struggled to keep pace, his medical bag bouncing against his saddle. Sarah had insisted he ride to town for supplies, her gentle hands on his chest, as she'd argued they needed medicine for little Emma's cough. Now, 3 hours later, with smoke rising black against the afternoon sky, he understood with crystal clarity that she'd sent him away deliberately. She'd known they were coming. The cabin came into view, and Caleb's heart stopped. The front door hung splintered on its hinges, windows shattered like broken teeth. Bodies lay scattered across the yard, 5 men in trail dust and leather, their weapons still clutched in death grips. But no sign of his daughters, no sign of Sarah. He hit the ground running before his horse fully stopped, Doc Morrison's shouts lost in the roar of blood in his ears. "Sarah, Lucy, Emma!" His voice cracked across the sudden silence. Inside, the cabin told a story of violence that made his ranger's experience seem tame. Furniture overturned, bullet holes pocking the walls, but the destruction followed a pattern, a fighting retreat toward the back rooms, toward where Sarah would have hidden the girls. He found the entrance to the root cellar behind the overturned kitchen table, cleverly concealed even now. His hands shook as he lifted the heavy wooden door. "Lucy? Emma? It's Papa!" 2 small faces peered up from the darkness, tear-streaked but alive. Lucy clutched Emma protectively, both girls trembling like leaves. "Where's Sarah?" he asked, even as relief flooded through him at seeing them unharmed. "She made us hide," Lucy whispered. "She said not to come out no matter what we heard. Papa, there was so much noise." Emma buried her face against her sister's shoulder. "Sarah fought them," she mumbled. "She fought them like an angel with a gun." Doc Morrison's voice called from outside, urgent and professional. Caleb kissed both daughters quickly. "Stay here until I come back. Promise me." He found the doctor kneeling beside the barn, and Caleb's world tilted sideways. Sarah lay motionless in the dust, her dark hair fanned around her head like spilled ink. Blood stained her dress, but her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. "She's alive," Doc Morrison said quickly, seeing Caleb's expression. Bullet grazed her temple, knocked her senseless. Another through her shoulder. Lost blood, but nothing vital hit, near as I can tell. Caleb dropped to his knees beside her, gathering her limp form against his chest. Her skin was pale as winter morning, but warm. Alive. "Sarah, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, dark lashes against marble cheeks. When she finally focused on his face, confusion clouded her gaze before memory crashed back. "The girls. Safe. You kept them safe." His voice broke on the words. "You magnificent, impossible woman. What did you do?" Sarah struggled to sit up, wincing as Doc Morrison began cleaning the shoulder wound. I recognized one of them. Martinez's man. They'd found me. Her eyes met his with stark honesty. I couldn't let them use the girls to force my hand. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. You sent me away. I had to. You'd have tried to protect me, and they'd have killed you for it. This way, she gestured weakly at the bodies scattered across their yard. This way they're dead, and we're alive. 5 men, Sarah. You took down 5 men. Doc Morrison shook his head in amazement as he worked. 2 shot clean through the heart from 30 yards. That's not luck, that's pure skill. She didn't deny it, and Caleb saw the truth in her eyes. This was who she'd been before him, before them. A woman who could kill 5 men and walk away. A woman whose past had finally caught up with their peaceful valley. There'll be more, she said quietly. Martinez won't stop. Not now. Caleb helped Doc Morrison lift her, carrying her toward the cabin. Then we'll be ready for them. You don't understand. These men... I understand perfectly. He stopped, meeting her gaze directly. You're part of this family now, Sarah Chen. Whatever comes, we face it together. Something shifted in her expression, surprise giving way to something deeper. For the first time since he'd known her, she looked truly vulnerable. Even knowing what I am, what I've done. Caleb looked at his daughters peeking out from the cabin doorway, alive because of this woman's courage. He thought of months of laughter, of gentle hands braiding Lucy's hair, of Sarah singing Emma to sleep. Especially knowing what you are, he said firmly. You're ours, Sarah, and we're yours. Time to stop running. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she nodded, finally accepting what he'd offered from the beginning. Not just protection, but belonging. The sun hung low over the mesa as Samuel watched Elena pack the last of her belongings into the worn leather satchel. 3 weeks had passed since the trial. 3 weeks since Judge Morrison had cleared her name and exposed Blackwood's corruption, but the victory felt hollow now. She moved with quiet efficiency, each folded garment and carefully wrapped trinket another step toward goodbye. You don't have to do this, he said, leaning against the doorframe of what had been their bedroom. The words came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by sleepless nights and the weight of impending loss. Elena's hands stilled on the ivory brush, the one he'd bought her in town last month when she'd mentioned how the desert wind tangled her hair. We both know I do. Her voice carried that familiar note of resolve that had first drawn him to her, back when she was just a stranger with secrets, and he was a desperate man with daughters to protect. The girls need you. He stepped closer, close enough to catch the scent of sage soap she favored. I need you. She turned then, and he saw the tears she'd been fighting to contain. Samuel, please, don't make this harder than it already is. Through the window, he could see Mary and Catherine in the yard, teaching the new foal to take sugar from their palms. They laughed as the creature's whiskers tickled their fingers, their joy a sharp contrast to the ache building in his chest. They didn't know yet. Elena had insisted on waiting until the last moment, unwilling to steal their happiness any sooner than necessary. Garrett's dead, Samuel said, desperation creeping into his voice. His whole operation is finished. There's no one left to come after you. There's always someone. Elena closed the satchel with steady hands. You know that as well as I do. Men like Garrett cast long shadows, and I've lived in darkness too long to believe the dawn lasts forever. He wanted to argue, to rage against the unfairness of it all. They'd fought so hard to build something real together, something worth keeping. The little ranch was thriving under their combined efforts. The girls had blossomed under Elena's patient guidance, their nightmares fading as love took root in soil that had known too much sorrow. Where will you go? California, maybe, or north to Oregon territory. Somewhere the name Elena Vasquez means nothing to anyone. The formal use of her surname cut deep. For months now, she'd been Elena Hart in all the ways that mattered, had worn his name like a promise they'd both started to believe. A knock at the front door interrupted them. Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, old habits dying hard, but Elena placed a gentle touch on his arm. "That'll be Deputy Miller with the horses." "Right." He'd forgotten about the escort Samuel had arranged, 2 reliable men to see her safely to the stage depot in Santa Fe. It was a small comfort, knowing she wouldn't face the journey alone, but it also made everything terrifyingly real. They walked to the front room together, their footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. Through the window, Samuel could see Tom Miller waiting respectfully by the gate, his partner Jake holding the reins of a sturdy mare packed for travel. "Mama Elena?" Mary's voice drifted from the kitchen, sweet and trusting. "Are you going somewhere?" Elena's composure cracked just slightly, a barely perceptible tremor in her shoulders. Samuel watched her gather herself, straightening with the same grace he'd witnessed a dozen times before, when facing down angry townspeople, when testifying against Garrett, when standing between his daughters and anything that might harm them. "Come here, little ones," she called softly. The girls appeared in the doorway, their faces shifting from curiosity to concern as they took in the packed bag and their parents' solemn expressions. Catherine, always quicker to read the currents of adult emotion, stepped protectively closer to her younger sister. Elena knelt down, bringing herself to their level. "I have to go away for a while." "How long?" Mary asked, her lower lip beginning to tremble. "I don't know, sweetheart. But you'll come back?" Catherine's voice was small, fragile as spun glass. "You'll come back like Papa always does?" The silence stretched too long. Samuel felt his heart breaking as he watched Elena struggle for words that wouldn't come. How do you explain to children that sometimes love isn't enough? That sometimes the very act of loving someone means letting them go? Elena pulled both girls into her arms, holding them tight against her chest. "I love you both more than all the stars in the sky," she whispered. "Remember that, always." Outside, Deputy Miller cleared his throat gently. The stage wouldn't wait, and darkness fell quickly in the desert. Samuel picked up Elena's satchel, the weight of it somehow heavier than he'd expected. The moment had come, and none of them were ready. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Marcus stood on the porch, watching his daughters chase butterflies through the wildflower meadow. Their laughter echoed off the surrounding hills, a sound that still amazed him after all these months. Sarah's auburn hair caught the light as she spun in circles, while little Emma's determined pursuit of a monarch butterfly led her in dizzy spirals across the grass. "Coffee's ready." Elena's voice came from behind him, warm and familiar. He turned to see her framed in the doorway, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, wearing the simple blue dress he'd bought her in town last month. The wariness that had haunted her eyes when they first met had been replaced by something he'd never dared hope for: peace. "The Morrison place looks good from here," he said, accepting the steaming cup and nodding toward the neighboring spread. "Smoke's rising from their chimney. Good to see." Elena moved to stand beside him, close enough that her shoulder brushed his arm. "Mrs. Morrison stopped by yesterday while you were checking the north pasture. She brought preserves and asked if we'd join them for Sunday dinner this week." The casual mention of shared meals and neighborly visits struck Marcus with quiet wonder. For so long, survival had been measured in days, sometimes hours. Now they spoke of Sunday dinners and church socials, of Sarah starting proper school in the fall, and Emma's need for new winter boots. The ordinary rhythms of family life that had once seemed impossible. "What did you tell her?" "That I'd speak with my husband." Elena's lips curved in a gentle smile. "She likes calling me that, you know. Mrs. Thorne. Sometimes I catch myself testing how it sounds." Marcus set down his coffee and turned to face her fully. 6 months had passed since their arrangement began, and in all that time, they'd maintained the careful boundaries of their bargain. But boundaries had a way of shifting when hearts were involved, and his had shifted so gradually he'd barely noticed until the change was complete. "Elena," he began, then stopped. Some words carried too much weight for careless handling. She must have heard something in his voice, because her expression grew serious. "What is it?" I've been thinking about our arrangement, about what we agreed to. A shadow crossed her features, and he realized how his words might sound. He reached for her hand, relieved when she didn't pull away. We said 6 months, he continued. Time for you to heal, to decide what you wanted. Time for the girls to adjust. That time's up. Elena's gaze drifted to where Sarah was now teaching Emma to weave flower crowns, their small heads bent together in concentration. Yes, it is. I know what I want, Marcus said quietly, but I need to know what you want. Really want, not what you think you owe me or what seems practical. For a long moment, the only sounds were birdsong and the distant lowing of cattle. When Elena looked back at him, her dark eyes held a depth of feeling that made his breath catch. When I came here, I was running from everything. My past, my mistakes, the person I thought I was. I never expected to find a home. She paused, her thumb tracing across his knuckles. I never expected to find love. The word hung between them, like a bridge. Neither had dared cross until now. The girls need a mother, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I need a wife, not because of any bargain, but because I can't imagine this life without you in it. Marcus Thorne, Elena said, rising on her toes to frame his face with her hands. Are you asking me to marry you? For real this time? I am, if you'll have me. Her kiss was answer enough, but when they broke apart, she whispered, yes, 1,000 times yes. Papa! Elena! Come see! Sarah's voice called from the meadow. They turned to see both girls holding up elaborate flower crowns, dirt-stained and grinning with pride. They'll need to know, Elena said softly, about the new arrangement. Marcus laughed, surprising himself. I think they figured it out before we did. Sarah asked me last week if you were going to be her real mama now. And what did you tell her? That I hoped so. That I'd never wanted anything more. Elena leaned into his side, and he wrapped his arm around her waist, holding her close as they watched their daughters, dancing in the morning light. The wilderness, that had once threatened to take everything from him, had instead given him more than he'd ever dreamed possible. In the distance, mountains stood sentinel over their valley, wild and eternal. But here, in this moment, with love freely given and family complete, Marcus Thorne had everything he needed to face whatever the untamed West might bring.